I never thought 3 words whispered by strangers in a hospital hallway could save my husband's life. But sometimes God speaks through the most unexpected voices, at the exact moment when hope seems impossible. My name is Anne, and what I'm about to share with you happened 4 years ago in Kansas City, Missouri. It's the story of how I kissed my husband goodbye, believing I'd never see him alive again, and how a conversation I accidentally overheard became the miracle we'd been desperately praying for. I know Matthew was dying. The doctors had run out of options. His body was shutting down, and without a bone marrow transplant from a family member, which he didn't have, we were looking at weeks, not months. I had accepted that I was about to become a widow at 28 years old. But what happened next? Well, it's the kind of story that makes you believe in divine appointments, in perfect timing, and in the truth that we're never as alone as we think we are. Now, let me take you back to that October day in Kansas City, when I sat on a cold metal bench outside the hospital, believing I was about to lose the love of my life. I had no idea that God was already orchestrating a miracle. One that began with a casual conversation between 2 nurses who had no idea I was listening. The October air carried the crisp scent of autumn leaves, and golden sunlight painted the hospital's brick walls in warm hues. But none of that beauty could reach the darkness in my heart. My husband, Matthew Collins, was lying in the oncology ward behind those walls, his body failing him in ways I never imagined possible. People walked past me, visitors carrying flowers, doctors heading home after long shifts, families sharing quiet conversations about dinner plans or weekend trips. For a moment I envied them. I envied their ordinary problems, their simple worries. I used to be one of them, just another woman thinking about what to cook for dinner or whether we needed milk from the store. But I wasn't that woman anymore. My world had shrunk to hospital rooms and the steady rhythm of machines keeping my husband alive. Matthew used to fill every room he entered. He was the kind of man who would spend 10 hours building custom cabinets, then come home with enough energy to help me grade papers and ask about my students. He had this way of laughing that made you believe everything would work out fine, even when life felt overwhelming. He was my anchor, my steady place in every storm, and now watching him fade away I felt like I was drowning in quicksand. 8 months ago we thought we had forever ahead of us. We talked about the vacation to Colorado we were saving for, the kitchen renovation Matthew wanted to tackle, maybe even starting the family we'd been praying for. Then Matthew came home one evening pale and exhausted, brushing off his fatigue as just another long day at the shop. But the tiredness lingered, deepened, and turned into unexplained bruises and nights when he struggled to catch his breath. The doctor spoke words that felt like a foreign language. Acute myeloid leukemia. Aggressive. His bone marrow was shutting down, no longer producing the blood cells his body desperately needed. Without a bone marrow transplant, they said we were looking at months, not years. I tried to stay strong in front of him, holding his hand and whispering, "God's got this, honey. We'll get through this together." But every night I cried alone in our bathroom, my sobs muffled by towels, because I knew something Matthew didn't want to face. He had no family. Matthew had grown up in Missouri's foster care system, never knowing his parents, never even learning if he had brothers or sisters somewhere in the world. Without close relatives, the doctors explained, finding a donor match was like searching for a needle in a haystack. We had joined the National Bone Marrow Registry, of course, but the specialists were painfully honest. The wait could stretch for months, maybe years, and Matthew didn't have that kind of time. Earlier today, when his oncologist pulled me into the hallway, her words shattered what little hope I had left. "And we're running out of options. If we don't find a compatible donor within the next few weeks." She didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. I knew what she meant. I sat there on that bench, tears streaming down my cheeks, feeling utterly helpless. I was a teacher. I spent my days helping children learn and grow. But I couldn't help the man I loved most in this world. I thought about the life we had built together. Our little blue house on Maple Street, the rocking chair he'd crafted for our front porch, the handwritten note he'd left on my pillow last Valentine's Day that still hung on our refrigerator. "You are my always and forever." The thought of losing him was unbearable, and yet deep down, a voice whispered that I might need to prepare for exactly that. I hated myself for even thinking it, but grief had already begun wrapping its cold fingers around my heart. Then, as if the universe hadn't been cruel enough, I overheard something that would change everything. Before I continue, I want to ask you something. If you're someone who believes that God still works miracles in ordinary lives, if you've ever needed hope during your darkest moments, or if you simply love hearing real stories about faith, family, and second chances, would you consider subscribing to this channel? When you subscribe, you're joining a community of people who understand that faith isn't always easy, but it's always worth it. And if you're going through something difficult right now, know that you're in the right place. This story is for you. Let me take you back to the beginning, to when life felt bright and full of possibility. Long before hospitals and medical charts became our daily reality, I met Matthew on a crisp September evening at our church's Harvest Festival. I had just started my second year teaching 4th grade at Westside Elementary, feeling confident and happy with my new life in Kansas City. The festival was one of those perfect autumn nights, hay bales stacked for seating, string lights twinkling between oak trees, and the smell of apple cider and funnel cakes filling the air. I remember him walking over to the ring toss booth where I was volunteering, carrying a toolbox and wearing work clothes dusted with sawdust. He'd been helping set up booths all afternoon, and there was something about his quiet confidence that made me look twice. When our eyes met, he smiled, not the flashy kind of smile meant to impress, but something genuine and warm. "Need any help with that?" he asked, nodding toward the game prizes I was struggling to hang from the booth's wooden frame. We spent the next 3 hours together that night talking about everything and nothing. How he loved working with his hands, creating something beautiful from raw wood. How I'd always dreamed of teaching, of making a difference in children's lives. How we both grew up without much family but found a home in our church community. When he laughed, really laughed, his whole face lit up and something deep inside me just knew. From that night forward, Matthew became a constant in my life. He showed up with small surprises. A wooden pencil holder he'd crafted for my classroom, wildflowers picked from the field behind his workshop, a book he'd found at a garage sale because he remembered me mentioning I wanted to read it. He had this gift for making ordinary moments feel magical. 2 years later, we stood in the sanctuary of Grace Community Church, exchanging vows in front of our church family. I wore my grandmother's pearl necklace, and Matthew cried openly when he saw me walking down the aisle. He was the kind of man who wore his heart on his sleeve, who believed in loving completely without holding back. We moved into a small blue house on the edge of Kansas City's suburbs, a fixer-upper that Matthew swore he could transform with his own 2 hands. And he did. He spent weekends refinishing hardwood floors, building custom shelves, and even crafting a beautiful rocking chair for our front porch. That chair became our evening sanctuary, where we'd sit side by side watching fireflies dance in the Missouri twilight, talking about our dreams for the future. Life felt complete even though it wasn't perfect. The only shadow was our struggle to start a family. We'd been trying since our wedding day, expecting it to happen naturally like it seemed to for everyone around us. But month after month brought disappointment. Doctors said my body wasn't cooperating, that conceiving might be more difficult than we'd hoped. We tried treatments, medications, countless appointments that left us emotionally and financially drained. Each negative pregnancy test felt like a small death, as if my body was failing both of us. But Matthew never once made me feel like it was my fault. He would hold me on those difficult nights when I cried until my head ached, whispering, "And God has a plan for us. Maybe it's not what we expected, but it's going to be beautiful." He even brought up adoption, talking excitedly about how many children needed loving homes, how we could build our family in a different way. I wanted to embrace that idea wholeheartedly, I really did. But part of me still longed to see a child with his gentle brown eyes and that crooked smile he got when he was trying not to laugh. One evening after another failed treatment cycle, I broke down in his arms, sobbing, "You deserve a wife who can give you children, Matthew." He gently lifted my chin so I'd meet his eyes and said, "And I didn't marry you for the children we might have. I married you because I love you. You are my family and you're enough. You've always been enough." That was Matthew, steady, kind, and selfless. He could have been frustrated, resentful, even bitter. Instead, he chose love every single time. Looking back now, I realize those struggles prepared us for what was coming. The nights we held each other through disappointment, the dreams we learned to reshape together, they became our foundation for surviving the storm that was about to hit. Because when Matthew fell ill, everything we thought we knew about life collapsed. And yet, even lying there weak and pale in that hospital bed, he still tried to be my strength. He joked about the terrible hospital food, teased me about worrying too much, and told me we'd get through this just like we'd gotten through everything else. But deep down, I knew this was different. This was about life and death. And I wasn't ready to imagine a world without him in it. The sickness crept in so quietly we almost missed it entirely. Matthew would come home from his workshop earlier than usual, brushing off his exhaustion with that familiar smile. "Just tired, sweetheart. Long day, that's all." But the tiredness didn't fade with rest. It grew heavier each day, like something invisible was slowly draining the life from him. Then came the bruises. Small ones at first, easily explained away. Maybe he'd bumped into a workbench or knocked against a cabinet door. But soon they appeared without reason, dark purple marks blooming across his arms and chest. One night I woke to the sound of him gasping, clutching his chest as if he couldn't get enough air into his lungs. The teacher in me knew something was seriously wrong. I begged him to see a doctor, and when he finally agreed, I thought it would be something manageable. Maybe anemia, perhaps stress from working too hard. Instead, we found ourselves sitting across from an oncologist who ordered test after test, each one revealing worse news than the last. I'll never forget the moment Dr. Patterson delivered the results. She sat us down in her office, her expression too serious, her words measured and careful. "Matthew, the tests show you have acute myeloid leukemia. It's an aggressive form and it's already quite advanced. Your bone marrow has essentially stopped producing healthy blood cells." I felt like all the air had been sucked from the room. Matthew just nodded, calm as always, and asked, "What do we need to do?" The answer was both simple and impossible. You need a bone marrow transplant. Without it, your body can't produce the blood cells necessary for survival. But the procedure requires finding a donor who's a genetic match, ideally a sibling or close relative. I looked at Matthew silently, knowing what he was going to say but praying somehow there would be someone, anyone he could call. But I already knew there wasn't. Matthew had grown up bouncing between foster homes throughout Missouri, never knowing his birth parents or whether he had brothers and sisters somewhere in the world. He had no family tree to search, no one to reach out to. We registered with the National Bone Marrow Registry immediately, but the doctors were brutally honest. Finding a compatible stranger could take months, possibly longer, and Matthew's condition was deteriorating rapidly. Time was not on our side. The disease moved fast. Matthew became pale and weak, his strong carpenter's hands trembling when he tried to hold a coffee cup. The man who once built furniture late into the night now struggled to walk from our bedroom to the kitchen. Even then, he tried to protect me from the worst of it. He made jokes about the hospital gowns, about how he'd always wondered what he'd look like bald once the chemotherapy started. At night, when he thought I was asleep, I could hear him whispering prayers under his breath. Not asking for healing but asking for strength. Strength for me to handle whatever was coming. I'd lie there holding his hand in the darkness, forcing myself to whisper, "We're going to beat this, honey. God's going to see us through." But inside I was terrified. Terrified of losing him. Terrified of waking up in our empty house. Terrified of facing a future I'd never planned for and didn't want to imagine. This afternoon, after another round of blood transfusions that barely helped, Dr. Patterson asked me to step into the hallway. Her voice was gentle but carried the weight of finality. "And I need to be honest with you. We're running out of time. If a match doesn't come through very soon, I'm afraid Matthew may only have a few weeks left." I nodded, unable to speak, feeling tears burn behind my eyes. I had seen loss before. Every teacher does, watching students move away or families face hardships. But nothing had prepared me for the possibility of losing Matthew. I walked outside to the hospital's small garden area, desperate for fresh air, desperate for anything that might steady my racing heart. That's when I heard it. Two nurses on their break nearby, talking casually, unaware that I could hear every word. "You know that patient in room 314? Matthew Collins? He looks exactly like this guy I went to high school with who lives out in Branson now. I swear it's like they could be twins." My heart stopped beating. Branson, Missouri. A small town nestled in the Ozark Mountains about 3 hours south of Kansas City. Could it be just a coincidence? People resembled each other all the time. But something deep inside whispered that this might be more than chance. For the first time in weeks, I felt something I'd been afraid to feel. Hope. Fragile, trembling hope, but hope nonetheless. I stood frozen in that garden as their words echoed through my mind. "He looks exactly like this guy, out in Branson now." Branson was one of those quintessential American small towns tucked into the rolling hills of the Missouri Ozarks. I'd been there a few times for school field trips to Silver Dollar City and remembered it as the kind of place where life moved slower, where neighbors still waved at strangers and everyone knew everyone else's business. If someone there really did look like Matthew, word would travel fast in a community that size. Matthew had spent his childhood bouncing between foster homes throughout Missouri, abandoned at birth with no information about his biological family. He'd often wondered aloud if there were people out there who shared his blood, who might have his same gentle eyes or his habit of running his hand through his hair when he was thinking. I remembered one quiet evening on our front porch when he'd admitted, "Sometimes I think about trying to find them, but what if they didn't want me then? What would be different now?" His voice had carried such quiet pain that I didn't know how to respond. So he'd buried those thoughts, focused on building a life with me, choosing to believe that family was something you created, not something you were born with. But now family wasn't just about belonging. It could mean the difference between life and death. That night I barely slept. I sat beside Matthew's hospital bed, listening to the steady beep of monitors, watching his chest rise and fall in the dim light. His face was so pale it almost blended with the white pillowcase, but he looked peaceful in sleep, younger somehow. I brushed a strand of hair from his forehead and whispered, "I'm going to find a way to save you, Matthew. I don't know how, but I'm going to try." The next morning I called into school and requested emergency family leave. My principal, Mrs. Henderson, had been incredibly supportive throughout Matthew's illness. She didn't ask questions, just said, "Take all the time you need, and we're praying for you both." I packed a small overnight bag, my hands shaking as I folded clothes. I didn't even know this person's name, only that he lived in Branson and apparently looked like my husband. I had no plan beyond driving there with Matthew's photo on my phone and a prayer that God would guide my steps. Before leaving, I stopped by Matthew's room. He was awake, managing a weak smile when he saw me. "You look like you're about to take on the world," he teased, his voice hoarse but warm. I kissed his forehead and whispered, "Maybe I am." He tried to ask more questions, but I stopped him gently. "Don't worry about anything, okay? Just rest and get stronger. I love you." I wanted desperately to tell him about Branson, about the possibility of family, about the slim chance that someone out there might be able to save him. But I couldn't risk building up his hope only to crush it if this turned out to be nothing more than wishful thinking. The drive south from Kansas City felt surreal. Interstate highways gave way to winding country roads, suburban neighborhoods replaced by rolling farmland and dense forests just beginning to show their autumn colors. As I crossed the bridge into Branson, I whispered a desperate prayer. "God, if there's someone here who can help Matthew, please let me find them. Please don't let this be another dead end." I parked near the town square and stepped out into the crisp October air. Branson moved at a different pace than Kansas City. Tourists strolling between shops, elderly couples sharing benches in the afternoon sun, teenagers riding bikes along tree-lined streets. Every face I passed I studied carefully, searching for some trace of Matthew's features, some hint of family resemblance. I approached a woman sweeping the sidewalk in front of a small cafe and showed her Matthew's photo. "Excuse me, I'm looking for someone who might look like this man. I was told he lives here in Branson." Her eyes widened immediately. "Oh my goodness, that looks just like Nathan Brooks. He lives out on County Road 15, past the old Miller farm. Is he a relative of yours?" My heart nearly stopped. Nathan Brooks. A name, finally, something concrete to hold on to. "Could you give me directions?" She did, pointing me toward a rural road that wound through farmland and scattered houses. As I drove away from town, my hands trembling on the steering wheel, I realized I was about to knock on a stranger's door and possibly change both our lives forever. The road to County Road 15 was barely more than cracked asphalt cutting through rolling hills dotted with oak trees and old barns. A light rain had started to fall, creating a misty haze that clung to my windshield and made the countryside look like something from a painting. I slowed when I spotted a weathered mailbox with faded black letters. And Brooks. The house behind it was modest but well-maintained, a single-story ranch with a wraparound porch, surrounded by a large yard and what looked like a vegetable garden. An old pickup truck sat in the gravel driveway, and somewhere in the distance I could hear a dog barking. For several minutes I just sat in my car with the engine running, gripping the steering wheel and trying to steady my nerves. What if I was wrong? What if I was about to disturb a complete stranger based on nothing more than a casual comment from two nurses? But then I thought of Matthew lying in that hospital bed, growing weaker by the day, and I forced myself to step out of the car. The wooden porch steps creaked under my feet as I climbed them. I knocked softly at first, then louder when no one answered. After what felt like forever, the door opened and I found myself staring at a man who made my breath catch in my throat. He was taller than Matthew, broader through the shoulders with the kind of tan that comes from working outdoors. His hair was darker, touched with gray at the temples, and his face showed lines that spoke of years spent squinting into sun and weather. But his eyes were exactly the same shade of warm brown as Matthew's, the same shape, the same gentle intensity. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice cautious but not unfriendly, with the slight drawl that marked him as a lifelong Missourian. With trembling hands I held out my phone, showing him Matthew's photo. "This is my husband. His name is Matthew Collins. Someone told me you might look like him." The man, Nathan I assumed, stared at the screen for a long moment. His expression shifted through confusion, disbelief, and something that looked almost painful. He rubbed the back of his neck, a gesture so familiar it made my heart ache because Matthew did the exact same thing when he was thinking. "Well, I'll be damned," he said quietly, then looked at me with softer eyes. "Who are you?" "I'm Anne. I'm his wife." Nathan stepped back from the doorway. "You'd better come inside." The interior of the house was simple but comfortable. Hardwood floors, worn leather furniture, the faint smell of coffee and something that might have been motor oil. Military medals hung in a frame on one wall, and I caught sight of what looked like a purple heart among them. Nathan gestured toward a chair. "Sit down. Please." He settled onto the couch across from me, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. "You're telling me this man is your husband?" I nodded, clutching my purse in my lap. "He's in the hospital in Kansas City. He's very sick, he has leukemia and needs a bone marrow transplant. The doctor said he doesn't have any family, but then I heard someone mention you and I had to come see." My voice broke and I couldn't finish the sentence. Nathan stared at the photo again, shaking his head slowly. I think he might be my brother." Those words hit me with such force I could barely breathe. "Your brother?" Nathan nodded grimly. "Our mother, she wasn't much of a mother to be honest. Had a bunch of kids with different fathers, never could seem to keep any of us together. When I was about 7 she had another baby, a little boy. I remember him crying a lot, remember her getting more and more frustrated with him." He paused, his jaw tightening. "One day she just left with him. Said she was going to the hospital because he was sick, but she never came back. Child Services eventually told me she'd given him up for adoption, signed away her rights at the hospital and disappeared. I was too young to do anything about it, but I never forgot him. Always wondered what happened to my little brother." Tears blurred my vision. "Matthew grew up in foster care. He's been looking for family his whole life." Nathan's voice cracked slightly. "I tried to find him once about 10 years ago. Hired someone to help me search, but the records were sealed or lost or something. I never even learned his name until today." He stood up abruptly, walking to the window and staring out at the rain. "What kind of transplant does he need?" "Bone marrow. The doctors said without it." I couldn't finish. Nathan turned around, his face set with determination. "Then let's do it. I don't need to think about it. He's my brother, and if there's any chance I can help him live, then that's what we're going to do." He walked to the kitchen and returned with his truck keys. "When do we leave?" For a moment I could only stare at him, overwhelmed by how quickly he'd made the decision. In my mind I'd imagined having to convince him, explain the situation, maybe even plead with him. Instead, it was as if he'd been waiting his whole life for this moment without even knowing it. "Are you sure?" I asked. "This is major surgery and you don't even really know us." Nathan looked at me with eyes that held decades of regret and hope. "Ma'am, I've spent 35 years wondering about my little brother, wondering if I failed him somehow by not being able to protect him when we were kids. If God brought you to my door with a chance to save his life, then I'm not going to waste it asking questions." We left Branson that evening, the rain now steady against our windshields as Nathan followed me north in his old pickup truck. For the first time in months my chest felt lighter. There was still fear. There would always be fear until Matthew was healthy again, but now there was something else too. Hope that felt solid like bedrock beneath my feet. When we arrived at St. Luke's Medical Center, I led Nathan through the familiar maze of sterile corridors to Matthew's room. Matthew was awake, propped up against pillows, his face lighting up when he saw me return, then clouding with confusion when his eyes shifted to the stranger behind me. The two men stared at each other for a long moment, and I watched recognition dawn in Matthew's eyes. Not the kind that comes from meeting someone you know, but the deeper recognition of seeing your own features reflected in another person's face. Nathan stepped forward, emotion thick in his voice. "I think I'm your brother." Matthew's eyes filled with tears instantly. "Hi, brother," he whispered. I stood there watching two men who had been strangers that morning discover they were family, watching them see themselves in each other's faces as if looking into a mirror that reflected not just appearance but something deeper. The bond of shared blood, shared loss, shared longing. Matthew reached out with a shaking hand and Nathan took it firmly, both of them too emotional to speak for several moments. Finally, Nathan cleared his throat. "We can talk more later, but right now I'm here to save your life." The medical team moved quickly once they learned about Nathan. Dr. Patterson ordered immediate testing to determine compatibility, explaining that sibling matches were often the best possible scenario for transplant success. The wait for results felt endless, but I could see something had already changed in Matthew's face. A lightness that had been missing for months. 2 days later, Dr. Patterson walked into the waiting room with the kind of smile that makes your knees weak with relief. "Nathan is an excellent match," she announced. "One of the best we've seen. We can schedule the transplant for tomorrow morning." I turned to Nathan, tears streaming down my face. "Did you hear that? You can save him." Nathan's expression wavered between wonder and determination. "Then let's get this done." That evening, Matthew and Nathan sat together for hours, sharing stories and filling in the gaps of their separate childhoods. I gave them privacy initially but eventually joined them, listening as they discovered shared mannerisms, similar ways of thinking, the same habit of tilting their heads when they were concentrating. "I used to dream about having a brother," Matthew admitted, his voice breaking. "I thought it was silly, like wishing for something that could never happen." Nathan smiled sadly. "I'm sorry I wasn't there for you growing up. I'm sorry you had to go through all that alone." "You're here now," Matthew said, gripping Nathan's hand with surprising strength. "That's what matters. You're here now." The transplant procedure took most of the following day. I spent those hours in the chapel, praying more desperately than I ever had in my life, surrounded by members of our church who had driven up to support us. Pastor Williams led us in prayer after prayer, and I felt held up by the faith of our community even when my own felt shaky. When Dr. Patterson finally emerged to tell us the surgery had gone perfectly, I collapsed into Nathan's arms, both of us crying with relief and exhaustion. The hardest part was over, but now came the waiting. Waiting to see if Matthew's body would accept his brother's gift, waiting to see if the new stem cells would take hold and begin producing healthy blood. Over the following weeks, Matthew grew stronger day by day. Color returned to his cheeks, his appetite came back, and his laughter, that wonderful sound I'd missed so much, began filling his hospital room again. Nathan stayed nearby, sleeping in the family waiting area and spending every possible moment with his newly found brother. 1 month after the transplant, Matthew was finally strong enough to come home. As we pulled into our driveway on Maple Street, Nathan following behind us, I noticed our neighbors had decorated our front porch with welcome home balloons and a banner that read, "Miracles happen here." Our church family had been incredible throughout the ordeal, bringing meals, handling yard work, and maintaining a prayer chain that seemed to span half of Kansas City. The experience had shown me a side of faith community I'd never fully appreciated, the way people can hold you up when you can't stand on your own. In the months that followed, Nathan became a permanent part of our lives. He found work with a construction company in Kansas City and rented a small apartment across town, but he spent most evenings at our house, often staying for dinner and helping Matthew with projects around the house as his strength returned. Watching the two brothers together was like witnessing a healing that went beyond the physical. They had both carried a lifetime of wondering about family, about whether they belonged anywhere, about whether anyone shared their blood and their history. Finding each other had answered questions they'd carried since childhood. One evening as autumn turned to winter, I found Matthew in his workshop behind our house, carefully sanding a piece of oak. He looked up when I entered, his face healthy and bright in a way I'd feared I might never see again. "What are you working on?" I asked. He smiled mysteriously. "Something for Nathan. A thank you gift." It turned out to be a beautiful jewelry box with intricate inlay work, the kind of craftsmanship that took weeks to complete. Inside the lid, Matthew had engraved a simple message. For my brother who gave me life twice. Once when we were born and once when we found each other again. When he presented it to Nathan at Christmas dinner, both men cried openly, and I realized I was witnessing something sacred. The restoration of a family that had been broken before either of them was old enough to understand what they'd lost. As we sat around our Christmas tree that year, Nathan helping Matthew arrange the nativity scene while I made hot chocolate in the kitchen, I thought about how drastically our lives had changed. A year ago, we'd been a couple struggling with infertility, feeling incomplete despite our love for each other. Now we were a family of 3, bound together not just by blood but by the miracle of second chances. Matthew's recovery was complete by spring. His latest blood work showed no trace of leukemia, and Dr. Patterson had officially declared him in remission. We celebrated with a barbecue in our backyard, surrounded by friends from church, neighbors, and Nathan's new girlfriend Sarah, whom he'd met at the construction site and who fit into our family like she'd always belonged. As I watched Matthew and Nathan grilling burgers together, laughing about something only brothers would find funny, I felt overwhelmed by gratitude. Not just for Matthew's healing, but for the way God had woven our broken pieces back together into something more beautiful than we'd ever imagined. That evening, after everyone had gone home, Matthew and I sat in the rocking chairs on our front porch. The original one he'd made for me years ago, and the new one he'd crafted during his recovery. The Missouri sunset painted the sky in shades of pink and gold, and fireflies were just beginning to dance in our yard. Do you ever think about how differently things could have turned out? I asked quietly. Matthew reached over and took my hand. Every day. But I've learned something through all this, Anne. Sometimes the worst things that happen to us lead to the best things. If I hadn't gotten sick, we never would have found Nathan. We never would have seen how strong our church family really is. We never would have learned how much we could handle together. He paused, watching the fireflies with a peaceful expression. I don't think God gave me cancer, but I think He used it to give us something we didn't even know we needed. Later that year, we received news that changed our lives once again. After 5 years of trying and failing to conceive, I was finally pregnant. The doctors couldn't explain why it had happened now after Matthew's illness and recovery, but they assured us it wasn't related to his treatment. Sometimes they said these things just happen when you least expect them. Our son was born the following spring, healthy and perfect, with Matthew's gentle brown eyes and my stubborn chin. We named him Nathan Matthew Collins, after the uncle who had saved his father's life and given us all a future we'd never dared to dream possible. Uncle Nathan cried when we told him about the name, and again when he held his tiny nephew for the first time. "He's beautiful," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "He's got the Collins eyes." As I sit here now, watching my husband teach our 3-year-old son how to use a small hammer in the workshop, with Nathan offering advice and encouragement from his spot on an overturned bucket, I'm struck by the mysterious ways life unfolds. 5 years ago, we were a couple facing infertility and feeling incomplete. 4 years ago, we were fighting for Matthew's life and facing the possibility of losing everything we'd built together. Today we're a family of 4, 5 counting Nathan, who's as much a part of our daily life as if he'd been there all along. Matthew is healthy and strong, his woodworking business thriving as word has spread about the quality of his craftsmanship. I've returned to teaching, bringing new energy to my classroom inspired by my own experience of learning that miracles really do happen. And Nathan has found more than just a brother. He's found a home, a place where he belongs, a family that was always his but had been lost to circumstance and poor choices made by people who should have protected them both. Our story began in despair, in a hospital room where hope seemed impossible. But it didn't end there. It ended with family reunited, with second chances and new life, with the profound knowledge that sometimes our deepest struggles lead us to our greatest blessings. Sometimes God's answer comes not in the dramatic moment of prayer, but in the quiet conversation overheard by accident. Sometimes healing comes not just through medicine, but through the discovery that you were never as alone as you thought you were. As I watch my son place a wooden block exactly where his father shows him, his little face serious with concentration, I'm reminded that families are built in many ways. Some are born, some are chosen, some are found when you least expect them. But all of them, every single one, are gifts that should never be taken for granted. The bench outside St. Luke's Medical Center is still there, and sometimes when I drive by, I think about the woman who sat there 4 years ago, believing she was about to lose everything that mattered. She had no idea that in just a few hours, She would overhear the words that would save her husband's life and give them both a family they'd never known they were missing. If I could go back and tell her anything, it would be this: hold on. Even when hope seems impossible, even when the darkness feels complete, hold on. Because sometimes the miracle you're praying for is already on its way, wearing work clothes and living in a small town 3 hours south, waiting for the moment when God will weave all the broken pieces of your story into something more beautiful. If this story touched your heart today, would you please show your support by hitting that like button? It really helps other people discover these stories of hope and faith. Please subscribe to the channel and ring the notification bell so you never miss a testimony of God's goodness. If God has done something miraculous in your life, share your testimony in the comments. And if you're going through a difficult time right now and you need prayer, please don't hesitate to share your request. The next video I want to share is a story that will absolutely blow your mind. It's about a man who had an encounter so extraordinary, so life-changing, that it's hard to believe, except it really happened. It's about how close we might be to Jesus' return. It was a divine warning, a wake-up call that left him forever changed, and it will change you too. Thank you so much for listening. God bless you.